A single remark ignited a controversy that has not yet settled. The Society of St. Pius X is nothing more than another Protestant sect. That statement was not accepted by everyone, and the reaction it provoked has, for many observers, ended up sweeping away the original accusation entirely. Because for a considerable number of Catholics, the word Protestant, thrown in this specific direction, sounds like a boomerang, and the question it raises, once it comes back around, is inverted from what was originally intended. What if Protestantism had actually entered the Church from the other direction? By the end of this video, you will be presented with two directly opposing arguments, each side leveling exactly the same accusation at the other, and you will understand why the real issue at stake hides behind a single word that both camps are using as a weapon without either side pausing to examine what the word actually requires. Begin with the facts, stated plainly and without exaggeration. In a recorded video statement, Bishop Thomas Paprocki of the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois, explained what he considers the actual problem with the Society of St. Pius X. He specifies clearly that the Mass itself is not the issue. The problem, he says, is something else entirely: disobeying the Pope and rejecting the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. And from there follows his sharpest conclusion. By disobeying the Pope and rejecting the Council, he argues, the Society of St. Pius X has become, in effect, another Protestant sect, one that believes itself to be in the right while insisting the Pope is in the wrong. He adds a striking fact to support his point. There exist today 53,000 distinct Christian denominations, yet Christ founded only one church. The multiplication of separate groups, he argues, does not reform the Church, it divides her further. This is the first argument, and to be fair, it is not baseless. There is an important point here that deserves to be acknowledged directly. Disobedience to the Pope is genuinely real in this case. The Society consecrated bishops against the explicit will of the Pontiff, and that is a grave matter, not a minor technicality to be waved away by either side of this debate. On this specific point, the bishop touches something genuinely sensitive and genuinely serious. But here is the other side of the argument, the one that reverses the entire framing of the situation. Because a growing number of voices, including some among the most theologically credentialed and institutionally respected in the Church, have begun arguing that the real Protestantization is not occurring where Paprocki imagines it to be located. And these voices are not offering vague impressions, they are offering concrete, documented examples. Recently in Germany, for the first time, 2 women were appointed to jointly head an entire Catholic deanery. A priest remains attached to the structure only as a moderator in a purely canonical and formal capacity, with no substantive leadership role in practice. At their formal presentation, the 2 women stated that they intended to embody synodality directly, governing together while listening to the Spirit. But a deanery led by laypeople, in which the priest has been reduced to a supporting and largely symbolic role, resembles, for a great many observers examining it honestly, something considerably closer to a Protestant congregational structure than to traditional Catholic governance. And this is not an isolated case that can be dismissed as a single unfortunate local decision. It is the same broader current that produced Fiducia Supplicans, the document authorizing blessings for couples in irregular situations. It is the same current that, in Germany specifically, has campaigned openly for the ordination of women and for lay people to deliver the homily during Mass. And national pathways of this kind are multiplying, each developing its own distinct set of practical rules, as though the Church could coherently sustain one doctrine in Germany and a different one in Africa, one pastoral practice in one country and an incompatible practice in another. A faith with genuinely variable doctrine, however, is by definition the precise opposite of Catholic unity. This is described, in the vocabulary that has dominated recent church discourse, as a synodal church, meaning a church that listens to everyone, discusses everything at length, and ultimately votes on the outcome. And here the parallel becomes impossible to avoid or explain away, because the Protestant ecclesial structure is precisely built on exactly this logic. the community that decides, the assembly that votes, the congregation that reinterprets, received teaching according to its own contemporary sense of what the moment requires. The Catholic structure, historically and by design, has always been the opposite of this. The Church that receives and guards what has been handed down, and the bishops whose specific role is to teach that inheritance rather than to negotiate it with the assembly gathered before them. Beyond questions of governance structure, in many countries, repeated surveys show that a substantial proportion of practicing Catholics no longer believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the very heart of Catholic faith and worship. And this is precisely, historically, what the reformers of the 16th century denied as the foundation of their entire theological project. This observation does not come only from traditionalists eager to score a rhetorical point. Cardinal Müller, who knows Catholic doctrine intimately from having served for years as its official guardian at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, has expressed this concern in remarkably firm terms. Regarding the German synodal path specifically, Müller stated that it has embarked on a path of Protestantization and that the fundamental criteria of Catholic ecclesiology have been lost within it. These are the words of a cardinal, delivered with the full weight of his former office, not the words of an anonymous blogger writing from the margins of Catholic media. And here the paradox that this entire situation produces becomes fully visible. On one side, the Society of St. Pius X is accused of being Protestant precisely because it preserves everything the Church has always done. The Mass, unchanged, the sacraments, administered exactly as they have always been administered, the doctrine, taught without modification or accommodation to contemporary sensibilities. On the other side, it is argued, a different church is visibly being constructed, one that genuinely does seem to imitate specific Protestant patterns in its deliberating assemblies, in laypeople assuming governing roles once reserved to ordained clergy, in new forms of blessing introduced through documents like fiducia supplicans, and in a vocabulary increasingly borrowed from the language of secular rights discourse rather than from the Church's own inherited theological tradition. These two competing pictures, placed directly side by side, cannot both simultaneously be true in the way each side presents them. Either the community that changes nothing is the genuinely Protestant one, or the community that is actively changing everything is the genuinely Protestant one. Both cannot occupy that same accusatory position at once without the word itself losing all coherent meaning. And common sense, on this specific point, is reasonably clear once the actual history is examined honestly. Historically, Protestantism was never born from those who preserved the Mass of all ages unchanged. It was born precisely and specifically from those who wanted to reform it, simplify it, and replace the altar with a table understood primarily as the site of a shared communal meal rather than a sacrifice. The etymology and the history of the word matter here and should not be set aside. 5 centuries ago, Luther aspired toward a church closer to the ordinary people, stripped of what he considered excessive ceremonial distance between clergy and laity. Latin was abolished from the liturgy. The sacraments were reduced in both number and theological significance. The altar was replaced by a table emphasizing shared fellowship over sacrifice, and the priest was recast primarily as the president of the assembly rather than as a man ordained to offer sacrifice in persona Christi. Anyone who examines certain contemporary liturgical practices with open eyes will find, without needing to search very hard, clear and unmistakable similarities to precisely this historical pattern. Let us pause here, because there is a real risk of moving too quickly toward a satisfying conclusion, and, in doing so, missing something more uncomfortable and more honest that the full picture actually requires. And the truth, as is so often the case in disputes of this kind, turns out to be more inconvenient for everyone involved than either side's preferred narrative would like it to be. We share Bishop Paprocki's position on one point that remains entirely valid regardless of everything else examined in this video. Consecrating bishops without the Pope's mandate is a genuinely grave act of disobedience, and the Society of St. Pius X is not exempt from responsibility for having committed it. This needs to be restated clearly, rather than allowed to disappear beneath the weight of the counter-argument that follows it. To claim, as some voices within or around the Society's orbit occasionally do, that it alone constitutes the true Church, while the entire visible structure of Catholicism elsewhere has fallen into error, carries a real and serious risk, and some individuals connected to this broader traditionalist current have indeed succumbed to exactly that temptation. A remnant theology of this kind, however understandable the frustrations that produce it, cannot be reconciled with what the Catholic Church has always taught about her own indefectibility and about the promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against her. But let us recognize, with equal honesty and equal seriousness, the perspective offered by the other camp, because it is just as pertinent and deserves exactly the same careful hearing rather than being dismissed as mere traditionalist grievance. A church that reshapes herself according to the logic of assemblies, votes, and passing worldly fashions betrays her own nature far more profoundly than those who simply continue kneeling, exactly as Catholics have always knelt, without demanding that the liturgy or the doctrine adapt itself to the preferences of any given historical moment. Fidelity to what has been received is not, in itself, an act of rebellion. It is the ordinary and expected posture of anyone who genuinely believes that what was handed down came from Christ rather than from any particular generation's own theological creativity. So perhaps the word Protestant, wielded as an insult by both camps against each other in these recent weeks, actually clarifies nothing at all when used this way. It becomes, instead, a convenient weapon brandished carelessly in every direction, satisfying to whichever side deploys it in the heat of an argument, but explaining remarkably little about what is actually at stake underneath the accusation. The real question being contested here is not, in the end, who deserves to be labeled Protestant and who does not. The real and considerably deeper question is this: who remains genuinely faithful to the inheritance they received, and who, by contrast, reshapes that inheritance according to their own preferences, their own cultural moment, and their own sense of what contemporary sensibilities require? Because fidelity, properly understood within the Catholic tradition, is measured neither by formal, mechanical obedience alone, nor by simple attachment to the past for its own sake, as though age itself conferred automatic legitimacy on any given practice. It is measured by one thing, and only one thing, stated as plainly as possible. Do you preserve what you received, or do you change it according to your own judgment about what the moment now demands? That is the actual test, applicable equally and without favoritism to every party in this current dispute, traditionalist and progressive alike. But precisely because we love the Church and we love her visible head, the Bishop of Rome, we cannot simply look away from the paradox this entire controversy has exposed. The accusation of Protestantism, as it is currently being deployed in the Catholic conversation of 2026, risks wounding the person who throws it more than the person who receives it, once the full historical and theological context is actually examined rather than assumed. A bishop who levels this specific charge at a community that has changed nothing in its liturgy, its sacramental practice, or its doctrinal content, while remaining largely silent about developments elsewhere that bear a considerably closer structural resemblance to the actual historical pattern of the Reformation, exposes himself to precisely the kind of scrutiny this video has just walked through in detail. The word, once picked up and examined honestly rather than simply thrown as an insult, does not stay where it was originally aimed. It travels back toward its source with an uncomfortable but entirely logical symmetry. So what remains then, for those of us watching all of this unfold from outside the specific institutional positions occupied by bishops, cardinals, and canon lawyers, who will ultimately have to adjudicate the canonical dimensions of this dispute through the Church's own proper processes? Several things remain certain, and they deserve to be stated with real clarity rather than left vague. It remains certain that the Church is not a parliament, and she will never become one, regardless of how many documents, working groups, or synodal assemblies attempt to reshape her governing structures according to that model. Christ did not establish a deliberative body designed to arrive at truth through majority consensus. He established a church entrusted with a deposit of faith to be guarded, taught, and handed on intact, not renegotiated by each successive generation according to its own preferences. It remains certain that the 53,000 distinct Christian denominations that currently exist as the historical fruit of division do not constitute a model to be admired or emulated in any respect. They constitute, instead, a solemn warning, a visible and permanent demonstration of exactly what happens when unity is sacrificed to the conviction that private judgment, however sincerely held, should take precedence over a received and authoritative teaching office. Every fracture within that vast and fragmented landscape began, at some point in history, with someone convinced they possessed a better understanding of the faith than the institution charged with guarding it. The cumulative result of that pattern, repeated across 5 centuries, is 53,000 separate communities, each convinced of its own fidelity to the gospel, each unable to achieve doctrinal agreement, even with its closest neighbors on the theological spectrum. And it remains certain that genuine and lasting unity is never built by abandoning fidelity in order to follow the world's evolving preferences on questions of morality, governance, or doctrine. It is built, instead, by humbly preserving what has been received, even when doing so comes at real personal or institutional cost, even when it means enduring accusations of rigidity, of being closed to dialogue, of standing outside the supposed spirit of the age. The saints who shaped the Catholic tradition across 2,000 years were rarely praised in their own lifetimes for their flexibility or their eagerness to accommodate contemporary fashion. They were remembered, when they were remembered at all, for their fidelity under genuine pressure to abandon it. The duty that falls to each of us watching this controversy from outside the corridors where these decisions are actually made remains essentially unchanged by any of this back-and-forth accusation. Do not allow yourself to be swept along by whichever faction currently commands the loudest online following or the most persuasive rhetorical framing. Return instead to what is actually essential. A Mass celebrated with genuine reverence and fervor, whichever valid liturgical form it happens to take. The doctrine received whole and entire from the apostles through an unbroken chain of teaching authority. The sacraments administered validly and celebrated with the seriousness their sacred character demands. This is where authentic Catholics are actually recognized, in the substance of what they believe and how they worship, not in whichever convenient label happens to be thrown at them or by them in a given week's controversy. And one prayer remains, formulated here with the seriousness it genuinely deserves, rather than offered as a mere rhetorical closing flourish. That the Pope and the pastors of the Church bring real clarity to this entire situation, so that no ordinary Catholic sitting in an ordinary pew has to wonder, week after week and controversy after controversy, who within the visible Church is actually safeguarding the faith she received from Christ, and who, whatever their stated intentions, is quietly dissolving it instead. Because when everyone inside the same household spends their energy accusing everyone else of secretly being an outsider, of having become, in effect, a foreign element within the family rather than a genuine member of it, perhaps the moment has arrived to set aside the accusations entirely and return instead to the gospel itself, to remember plainly where the Church actually came from, and to remember with equal clarity who it was that first called her into being and gave her the mission she still carries today. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.